Hey all, here at OS Reviews. So we're taking a closer look at the Umidigi A13 Pro Max 5G. That name is a handful, but this is on paper one of the better value Android smartphones that you can find at the moment. For under $240, it rocks a 6.8-inch 90Hz display coupled with 12 gigabytes of RAM, 256 gigs of built-in storage, which is further expandable, and also has a ginormous 5,150 milliamp hour capacity battery, making this a endurance champion. And this phone I've used on and off for about 3 days before I needed to recharge it again. So this is a device that will definitely last you if you're a little bit further away from an outlet. Other specs here are also inclusive of a overall, I would say mid-tier camera experience, inclusive of a 64 megapixel primary lens. You also get 2 more 5 megapixel sensors meant for depth, as well as a telephoto, as well as a 24 megapixel selfie camera, which is using a hole punch cutout here at the very front, which is also a little bit more clean compared to other budget Umidigi phones we've seen in the past, including the F3/F3S, which is still using that water drop notch design. It's good to see that they have improved in terms of the screen to body ratio, a faster refresh rate, and also supports 18 watts fast charging here at the bottom, although fast by air quotations in the sense that that big 5,000 milliamp hour capacity battery will still take you a little under 3 hours to fully top up. But again, you don't have to be charging it too often at all, since this thing is so energy efficient, powered by the Dimensity 900. It's an octa-core chip, which is clocked up to 2.4 gigahertz. So let's take a closer look at the design of this phone first. And I have to say, in terms of the way it looks, you can't necessarily tell that it's a budget phone. It reaches up to 400 nits in terms of brightness, which is about average, I'd say. It doesn't become too problematic even if there's a bit of light hitting on it, but may not be necessarily as bright as more flagship tier phones. Now, the rim of the device is constructed out of a polycarbonate plastic, but doesn't feel too cheap either because of the overall larger device. It doesn't feel hollow, everything feels still quite substantial. On the right-hand spine, you'll find access to a volume rocker and also the fingerprint scanner, which also dubs as a power key. The very top here features a 3.5mm headphone jack, always nice to see, and on the other side there is the nano SIM card slot. It supports 2 cards, or you can use the second one for expanding the storage using a micro SD, and the very bottom here also features the single loudspeaker and the USB Type-C port for charging. Last but not least, the back here I think also looks quite interesting. It still is made of polycarbonate plastic material, similar to many other phones, including Samsung's Galaxy A series these days, but it has an interesting finish which slightly shimmers against the light. This kind of sanded texture also makes it slightly easier to grip and doesn't attract too much fingerprints either, which is nice. With that being said, there is definitely a little bit of a camera bump, but the good news here is it doesn't wobble too much either when you're setting it down. Overall, looks quite modern. Accessories that I'll briefly mention will get you staples such as a TPU soft carrying case, which pretty much all Umidigi phones will find in the box, and on this one it actually fits quite well. It also makes the camera bump not quite as noticeable, but just protects the phone a little bit more. You'll also find access to a quick user guide, a classic red accented USB Type-C cable, SIM card ejector tool, and also a fast USB charger. And by the way, a factory screen protector has been applied out of the box, so it's also preventing some scratches on the display when you're first using it, which is nice. But overall, I do like the way that it looks and feels in the hand. If anything though, the fingerprint scanner, which is by the way super fast and responsive, it's always on, sometimes is a little bit too sensitive. So whenever you have your phone sitting down, for example, and I just want to pick up the phone, the fingerprint scanner will already try to scan and see if something is active. So it is always there, kind of waiting for you, and you'll be greeted to a version of Android 12 that is interesting in the sense that it's pretty clean in terms of you don't get too much bloatware on here, which is good. You do have access to the universal app tray if you want to bring this back, and there's also the Google feed there on the left, which gets you pretty much all the essentials that you would want at a glance. The part that is new though is the notification shade has been overhauled compared to past Umidigi phones. Now if we swipe over from the top right hand side, you have access to a tray which has definitely heavier customization going on. All of those staples can be found at a glance. Now, if you swipe over from the left-hand side, you can actually take a look at if there's any notifications to quickly respond back to. So it's basically been split into two panels now. And as a reminder, the previous launcher was just a lot more vanilla in terms of the way it looks. The same thing can be said when you go into settings, but as you can tell, everything is still super fast and responsive. You'll find just slightly more colorful icons that are being used here on this latest ROM of this Android 12 experience. Out of the 256 gigs of built-in storage, about 240 are left after you install some software updates and the OS, which is still more than enough, I think, for most folks. And if 12 gigs of RAM is not enough for you, you can even use some virtual RAM. So you can go into the memory expansion and you can further allocate up to 5 gigs from that 256 gigs of storage to act as virtual RAM. So in total, getting you 17 gigs with virtual RAM. So this is something that really reaches into the flagship territory in terms of that particular spec alone. That's quite interesting here. Now you can also find under display the ability to check out the refresh rate, and if you wanted to, you can actually dial the refresh rate down from let's say 90 Hertz over to 60 Hertz if you want to get even longer battery life. Now, jumping into the camera experience next, I would say this is the one part where it's still kind of a mid-tier phone, and that does show in the sense that it's not going to really beat a flagship, something like a Pixel or even an iPhone, in terms of consistency of the photography capabilities. Images are just a little bit more on the muted side, but you do have the ability to toggle between HDR, and there is an AI mode that you can play around with as well, which can automatically detect the scene that you're pointing at and try and slightly change some of the color profiles to compensate. Now you can also tweak the, again, resolution of those photos up to the 64 megapixels, although you can't use the AI or the HDR modes in that 64 megapixel size, but you'll get a lot of details for you to then further crop. Some weaknesses here include no optical image stabilization and no really effective night mode to speak of. So if you are in darker environments, that's when things will start to degrade a little bit more. Video can be recorded up to 4K at 30 frames per second. And here's a Pro mode, which is reminiscent of some of the Lumia Nokia phone interfaces from back in the day. So taking a look at some of those sample images that we've taken there, again, in moderate and good lighting environments, you're still talking about some pretty satisfactory looking results, which are more than good enough to use and preserve your memories with, even share on social media. The only downside here is out of the 3 camera lenses, again, you have a depth sensor and 2x zoom, but there is no wide angle lens, which I think would have been a more popular choice. And I would prefer replacing it with something like the macro or telephoto lens in terms of just practicality. So again, I would say it is about average and what you would expect from a mid-tier smartphone these days in terms of the photography experience, which is to say, really not bad at all. Moving into a demo of the video and the audio experience, let's take a look at this through YouTube. Alright, so some takeaways being that the screen is definitely quite immersive and beautiful to look at because of the large size combined with that new hole punch instead of a teardrop notch. It just seems even larger and just a beautiful panel in general with pretty good colors as well as wide viewing angles, and for an IPS LCD it is one of the better ones I've seen in this price range. Speaker quality also gets reasonably loud and doesn't distort even at higher volume levels, but again, it's not a stereo set. Maybe in the future if they can also pack in another one as the earpiece, it would be even better, but for what it is, you can always use the headphone jack or wireless headphones if you want to get even better or personalized audio, I should say. Now perhaps the most impressive part here though is that the phone feels very fluid. It has to be a combination of the Dimensity 900 plus the 90 Hz refresh rate, but as a result, when you are swiping down longer menus and lists on YouTube, everything still feels quite fast and fluid, as you can see there. Now next, let's take a quick look at some of the web browsing performance. We're going to jump into the browser here, and let's try loading up something like The Verge. Now, one area they were able to cut down on costs a little bit, like on most budget to mid-tier Android phones, would be the haptic sensor. So the vibrations of the keyboard are not the best in the world. They just feel a little bit rattly for my taste, but you can always turn that feature off if desired. An area where you only get some better haptics, unfortunately, once you venture into the flagship and more expensive phones, but just something to keep in mind. Now, regardless, when it comes to actually loading back web pages, as you can tell, it's a mostly fluid experience. With that being said, you can still find moments where there might be maybe a couple of dips in the refresh rate or frame rate, I should say. But for what it is, considering this price range of the phone, you're still getting a overall very satisfactory result, considering that The Verge is a complex site with lots of videos and ads that are being loaded here at the same time. We can even request the desktop version of the site, and as you can tell here, the processor can overall keep up really without too much problems, thanks to also Wi-Fi 6 as well as, again, 5G network connectivity. Things are all going to be pretty quick in terms of loading along. The plastic chassis also helps in terms of getting a fast reception, and I was consistently getting almost full bars when it comes to both cellular as well as Wi-Fi alike. The entire phone actually feels quite comfortable and cool during operation, so it never overheats or having any thermal throttling issues to speak of, which is good. Now that 12 gigabytes of RAM is also pretty decent in terms of if you're trying to get more multitasking done, it can shine a lot more. Right now we have about 5 or 6 different applications open, and we still have around 7 gigs of RAM left. Again, a little overkill, I think, on a phone, but nonetheless good to have and perhaps more useful down the road as apps and maybe different programs become even more power intensive. When it comes to the basics, such as making phone calls, I tested it earlier with AT&T and T-Mobile here in the Seattle area, and I was also mostly satisfied. Good in terms of picking up what you're saying, the earpiece is nice and loud, even if there's a little bit of background chatter. There is a slightly overhauled, I would say, alarm clock app, which has a bit more of a fancy animation there for the clock, but really aside from that, everything else is just standard Google utility tools that you get baked in, which is good, and no bloatware of any kind that you will find. Just the essentials, maps, access to the regular Google Play Store where you can download more content based on what you actually need. Moving into a little bit of casual gaming, although this isn't a gaming phone per se, it can still handle casual games without too many problems. You will notice some small moments of hesitation at times on more graphically demanding titles like PUBG or Asphalt, for instance, but everything is still more than playable and certainly delivers a overall enjoyable enough experience considering the price and cool during operation, which is good. And ultimately, you're still getting a pleasant experience thanks to that large cinematic display, as well as, again, the super long battery life enables you to use this phone for just hours and hours. Last but not least, other applications where it can shine include, say, comic or ebook reading, things like Webtoon. It can definitely do quite well because of how overall good looking I think the display here is, very immersive, as well as having, again, pretty accurate looking colors with good viewing angles, and that long battery life as well certainly helps. So other applications that you may want to try out, whether it's doing a bit of e-reading, it can also shine and offers a still very satisfactory experience. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Umidigi A13 Pro Max 5G. Still a silly name, I have to say. They should really consider shortening that up, but ultimately this is still a very good budget phone, I have to admit, when it comes to delivering pretty solid performance for what it is, a very good display, overall a pretty stylish design, plenty of RAM, and also that giant battery life to boost. You can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. Still is, I think, a pretty solid mid-tier / budget phone. That's been the Umidigi A13 Pro Max 5G.